Joining me now is Mike Papantonio. He's the co-host of Ring of Fire, which is also on the TYT network. He's sometimes known as America's Lawyer, which is a pretty neat title. And Pap, I had dinner with someone from that is associated with another giant law firm, and they said, "Oh, we noticed you're working with Mike Papantonio. That guy's a legend." So
that's a nice compliment.
Yeah. So that just happened this week. So just good context for our audience. But there's two things I want to talk to you about, Pat. But the first one is that you're featured in a movie. It's called The Devil We Know, and it's about a case that you brought, and part of why probably other lawyers see you in the way that I just described. You got a $670 million settlement out of DuPont. What was it for? What had they done wrong?
DuPont had poisoned the drinking water of 70,000 people, Cenk. They knew that they had been doing it for 50 years, and they poisoned it with something called C8, which is a carcinogen, but also causes a whole host of neurological diseases. It causes birth defects. And I think the reason that the case was difficult in so many ways because DuPont had such a strong control over the regulatory agencies all up and down the Ohio River Valley. They had control of the politics all up and down the Ohio River Valley. But a young lawyer came to me with a project. He had worked for about 10 years and had no success. And they asked, would I try the case and see how a jury reacts? And the jury did not react at all well for DuPont. And they figured they had to close it down. Actually, the total was 675 plus about another 300 million over a period of years. So what we're able to do, we're able to fix the drinking water problem. It doesn't fix the problem overall. C8 is going to be in that environment, unfortunately, for 1 million years. That's how long C8 stays in the environment. It's bioaccumulative. Every time you're exposed to it, more builds up in your system. But it was the mentality of DuPont, and that is, let's make a big profit. They hid the information from the public, knowingly hid it. They kept it a big secret. This movie that you're talking about has been done by some very, very capable, really talented documentary people who've won a couple of Oscars for other documentaries they've done. And I guess I was so impressed with their ability to take a very complicated issue and make it into a really, really entertaining movie called The Devil We Know.
Yeah, and if you're watching this later on YouTube or Facebook, we'll have the link to the trailer for the movie. It's incredibly well done, so you can check it out for yourself. But I actually want to ask a couple more questions about that, Pat, because Mike McCabe, who was a former deputy administrator at the EPA, said something that I found to be even more troubling, because it's one thing to do a case against DuPont, and I think that trial lawyers oftentimes get a bad rap in the country, and it's not an accident. There's a lot of corporate propaganda behind that effort, and because trial lawyers are one of the few folks who hold corporations accountable. But McCabe was saying, unfortunately, the EPA oftentimes does not. How does the EPA sometimes, help companies like DuPont fast track things that they shouldn't, that aren't safe?
Well, what happens, Cenk, is that it's called corporate capture, and the way that works, you see it with the FDA, you see it with the SEC, you see it with the EPA, virtually all of the regulatory agencies. Typically, and it happened in DuPont. It's happened in the opioid case I'm working on right now. But what ends up happening is the industry goes to somebody who's making $100,000. They're in mid-level management. And they say, we know that you're working on this project. We know you're looking at regulating us, and we don't want to interfere with that. But oh, by the way, when we get done with this, let's talk about a job with us. And then they throw a number of $300,000 out. And unfortunately, the system allows them to do that. And so it's total corporate capture. These regulators, they're human. They're saying, look, I'm making $100,000. This company's talking to me about $300,000. And so all of a sudden, that regulation that should be protecting consumers ends up protecting the corporation. And it's a very common process. And the way they beef that up, Cenk, is they'll go to what we call biostitutes. The corporation hires biostitutes in various places around, maybe Harvard or Yale, and they'll hire scientists that will say anything for the right amount of money. That scientist is then hooked up with that regulator, and they have this relationship where the scientist gives the regulator cover. And so that's a process that's very common. It's not just in environmental cases. We see it in pharmaceutical cases. We see it in regulatory of the SEC. We see it really, really often these days, more so than we saw 10 years ago.
So it took me a minute to figure out what biostitute was. When I was like, oh, I get it, a combination of things. Okay. So one more thing, Pap, about this, because you got me nervous about Teflon. So should we not be using those Teflon pans?
You should not, well, here's the problem. C8 is actually used to make Teflon. And the company says, well, there's no off-gassing, but the pans that they test typically are older pans where the off-gassing from C8, a new pan, for example, there'll be off-gas of the C8 with a new pan. I don't see any reason to use Teflon. I mean, you know, it was a great sales mechanism. You know, it sounded good, but it's no better than oil in a pan, olive oil or butter or whatever. It's the safer thing to do, and we don't use it. I mean, we cleaned out our Teflon pans once we got this information. Once I started looking at the scientist and talking to the scientist who had worked on this project, it kind of scared the bejesus out of me. But they've done such a great job holding back the criticism of Teflon. It's kind of a one step at a time. I had to first of all talk about C8, the fluorocarbon C8. And I had to make inroads to show the medical causation between C8 and human injury. And now the next step will be to take a closer look at have some better epidemiology on the relationship of just the Teflon pan.
All right. So now let's talk about another story that came out recently about the FBI apparently keeping files on climate change protesters. And so Mike Papantonio does Ring of Fire. That's on the TYT network. He does several different shows. So he does the news all the time, and he cares deeply about these, and he's progressive. That's why I'm asking you about it. So, Pap, what did the FBI do here, and how concerned are you?
Well, what we've learned in the last few weeks is that the government has stopped spying. They haven't stopped spying on citizens since the 1940s. You know, Truman came out with what he called it was called, I believe, the Shamrock Project in I think it's 1947, and it created in the NSA the ability to spy on Americans. The only thing that's changed since the 40s is we've stopped paying attention to the problem. Right now, the FBI, CIA, NSA, and all of the other spy agencies in this country are treating environmental activists. That's where this is really going. Environmental activists are under heavy pressure. It's as if they're terrorists. I mean, we're talking about people being spied on in Iowa, peaceful civil disobedience taking place in Iowa. Bill McKibben, who you've interviewed, I think, a couple of times. Bill McKibben is led the charge for climate change. He's the only guy out there that's really, really willing to push the limits in civil disobedience. But he's a target. Those are actually the words that the words that the agencies use is terrorists. That's what they call these environmentalists who are engaged in peaceful civil disobedience. According to the documents that we've released, the problem is that have been released. The problem is very real. If you've ever shown up at a pipeline protest, which you have, I remember you being right in the middle of the protest. Your name, I can assure you, Cenk, you are on their watch list. A climate march or engaged in any kind of activities that might make the world a better place, there's a good chance that you're probably going to be followed by some of those intelligence agencies. And you know, when you were out there, you probably had a sense that was going on, but now we have the documents, Cenk. We didn't have the documents before. We had supposition. We knew about the Frank Church hearings, right? We knew that in 1975, Frank Church found the FBI and the NSA actually spying on American citizens, spying on Martin Luther King, spying on Muhammad Ali, spying on Seymour Hersh because of their activities that was contrary to the interest of governmental interest. So the Church hearings haven't changed any of that, and we knew about the Frank Church hearings, but I think we forgot about what Frank Church found out in those hearings, that these agencies had been monitoring citizens without a warrant for decades. And here we are decades later finding out that the domestic spying programs really never stopped. In fact, they've become more sophisticated. So I think that's something that people, we too easily dismiss this idea that it's okay, that, it's okay to spy on us. But when you have environmental activists or civil rights activists that are out there trying to make a change, and we realize the government feels that they are terrorists, that's a pretty serious indictment of democracy.
Yeah, and at the same time, they de-emphasize the FBI tracking extremist right-wing groups who actually oftentimes have done terrorism in America, actual terrorism, planning to blow up buildings, murders, shootings, etc. And so their priorities are all screwed up. So last question about that, Pap, is it sounds like that's another case of, in a sense, corporate capture, right? So
well, it is. Yes, it is. It's the modern Pinkertons is what we have here. We have these agencies that have become an extension of corporations. It's hard to really put your arms around that, but they're out there because Exxon doesn't want what's happening to go on. DuPont or Dow or whoever it is, they have access to senators and representatives and agencies that they can get them all chummed up on the idea we got to do something about these people. And unfortunately, that is the norm. That's the new norm. If you think back to the Pinkertons in the 30s and the 40s, all they were an extension of corporate America. We had to stop the unions. They were franchised to a great deal by the American government. So there's really no difference here. It's just that we haven't paid attention to it.
All right, Mike Papantonio, co-host of Ring of Fire. Everybody check that out. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chang.